usually in Hades 2, there's a correct way to play a weapon. That's not to say the game stops you from doing other things. There's just certain synergies that are far more powerful if you play a weapon in that way. Almost like that's the playstyle the Aspect was designed for. For example, the Aspect of Selene gives you a special hex that amplifies the damage from your Omega moves. So clearly, you should do that with Omega moves, right? And then you can do that completely wrong by not using your Omega moves at all and still melt stuff. So I'm going to be going through a pretty fun run that I just did that gets into some crazy combos. And it's all enabled by a Daedalus Hammer upgrade that I was offered at the beginning of a run. Because I went into this thinking, hey, I'll do Omega moves. Nope, I got offered Exhaust Rider, where my dash strike hits 3 times. When it says it does +3 hits, it doesn't mean that it hits different enemies. No. It means you AoE everything around you additional times, triggering all of the effects you would normally apply with your attack. So after that, I looked out for things that might scale really well off of my attack. Like, let's just say Poseidon's Wave Strike. So that way, every time I use my dash strike, there's not only an AoE around Melanoe, but every time that AoE hits enemies, it creates more AoEs. Because what better way to clear the screen than getting AoEs to go with your AoEs? And yes, I tested this. It does trigger multiple times. It has the synergy. We are playing this wrong, and it's amazing. And so that's where my run started to take shape. A dash strike, I did AoEs, I killed everything with insane burst damage. The low-level enemies in the first zone were absolutely a piece of cake. I felt super overtuned for them. But there were still a few goals I wanted to hit. Like, number 1, could I actually use Selene for anything useful? And number 2, let's enable origination, since that gives a 50% damage bonus, and doing more damage is always good, even if your damage is already ridiculous. Also, maybe let's get some AoE to go with our AoE, because if enemies spread out, the waves won't really overlap on them. To this end, I picked up a boon from Hera for my cast. Not only does this add a little bit more AoE damage, but it's one of the 2 curses that's going to be inflicted very reliable to enable origination. Now at this point, the build was feeling really good, but there was one opponent I encountered in the first zone that it was completely useless against. So as it turns out, undersea denizens are quite powerful and dangerous, to the point where you can't dash strike them because all you're armed with is a fishing rod. So this was by far the hardest battle that I had in the first zone.
Caught out.
So maybe the sea creatures are a little bit too OP, and I guess I'll have to have an even better build if I want to take them on. Maybe I'll have better luck with the zone's final boss. Now unfortunately, Hecate likes to teleport around a bit. This makes it a bit harder to land those dash strikes. Also, some of her moves do AoE around her, and sometimes she goes invulnerable. All of these things definitely made sure that the fight took a little bit longer, but it was pretty darn safe. I had Phrenos, I have an Arcana blocking 3 shots, which I very much need because I'm a little bad at this game. But even though my uptime on the boss wasn't great, when I had that uptime, after I could drop my cast, dash strike in, press my attack button, it melted chunks off of her health. The amount of burst damage this puts out is nothing short of incredible. And I even got to use the Hex a little tiny bit. Though with Hecate safely down, on to Oceanus, and all of the ocean's bounties that await. Hopefully they're easier than that fish from earlier. And since so far my Hex wasn't really doing anything, I decided to go for the Path of Stars. After all, if I could maximize the value from the Hex, maybe I could use it as a press this button for massive damage. And sure enough, the very first reward that I was offered going into the next zone was the Path of Stars. But also there's a Chaos Gate here. So let's do that first, and come back to the Path of Stars later, because I'm sure it's going to be offered to me again. This definitely isn't foreshadowing for anything at all that happens later in the video.
That song again.
Normally the second zone is where I start to take some chip damage. Enemies are a little bit more dangerous, they tend to spread out more, and some of them explode on death, which is just downright mean. But in this case, I was able to blast through. Or you could say I was able to blitz through, with a little bit of help from Zeus. This also means I'll have a much more reliable uptime on my origination, and so long as I'm weaving my different moves together, I'll have a very nice damage bump, because I can apply the blitz, then pop it with my dash strike, thus doing significantly more damage than if I had to continually hit an enemy to continually apply damage from another source. To make my AoE even better, I continued down the stormy path by taking Static Shock. Yes, it triggers on each hit, so with the Dash Strike, you are getting tons of lightning AoEs, and also the Splash AoE, and also the AoE from all the hits. You know, maybe I have too many AoE effects? Nah, actually, the AoE is awesome at this point, and yes, all of my magic is sealed. This is fine. Like I said, there's nothing about the aspect that I'm playing which rewards you for using Omega moves. I mean, who would even do that? But be honest with me, and comment down below for this one. Is it really playing it wrong if everything's melting? Because I would say the goal of any weapon or any aspect is to melt every enemy on screen. And provided you're able to do that, then you're doing it right without any problems. So with all the new AoE in hand, it's time to take on the AoE boss, the 3 Sirens. And you may have noticed something. I didn't show any clips of me getting the Path of Stars. And no, that is not me skipping and editing. Because remember right at the start where I did this? Yeah, it turns out that was a mistake because the Path of Stars was not offered again for all of Oceanus. Good thing I'm not relying on that hex or anything. With the Sirens down, I guess it's on to the next zone, because we've got to rescue the best boy Cerberus. And first thing that I was offered was... no, not the Path of Stars. It was a Daedalus Hammer. In this case, I selected Melting Cross, because if any enemy is going to be problematic, it's going to be an armored foe. This build has a lot of damage and a lot of burst damage, but it has very little crowd control. It's not like you're able to freeze enemies. It's not like you're really able to do too much to stop them from hitting you. What you can do is melt through their armor, because with all the additional hits, Melting Cross is going to take out 20% of their armor per hit. That way, once the enemy's armor is removed, they're going to be vulnerable to interruption from regular damage. And much like I expected, this means enemy's armor is gone pretty much instantly as soon as I touch them. And when combined with all the build's AoEs and multiple hits, it had a really interesting side effect. From this point on, the big tanky enemies, the ones that are usually the most intimidating and problematic, were downright trivial. But the smaller enemies, ones that tend to run around a lot, be more mobile, and spread out, were actually the thing that I struggled with a little bit more because I often had to dash strike to them individually, rather than blowing up the large group. I guess one thing that could have helped here is, instead of using the cast from Hera for the extra damage and hitch, I could have used the cast from Aphrodite to drag enemies to a central point. Instead, I ended up with Aphrodite's magic recovery, you know, the thing that I'm definitely using a lot of. But realistically, it was just a very, very nice way to enable origination, because now, as soon as everything's near me, it is affected by Weaken, which is one of the 2 curses needed. If I can get Slip, maybe on my attack, well, then it would be fully automatic and passive, provided I'm in range to do any relevant damage anyway. Continuing on with Zone, not too much else happened, or at the very least, nothing eventful enough to include in the video. I did get a hand from Echo, doubling the boon effect on, of course, my attack. And yes, there's some diminishing returns here, but the level bump is so huge that it's still going to feel impactful. I also probably face tank stuff a little bit too much, but this build creates a lot of screen clutter, so it was very hard for me to see what the enemies were actually doing. And also, the closer I am to enemies, the more AoEs I'm creating, so clearly, standing in the fire just means I can AoE them down. Yes, I did also get the Slip. So hey, free origination for everybody, always. So I zipped through the rest of the zone, freed Cerberus real quick, and now it's on to Tartarus, where I selected the Fig Leaf from Dionysus. Number 1, and primarily because I want to level it up. But number 2, it is so OP in both Olympus and Tartarus. Those fights are genuinely terrifying, they do a lot of damage, and at max rank, you can avoid 3 of them. That's right, you can avoid 3 whole encounter rooms, which also means if you have any heal at the end of the encounter effect, yes, those will trigger, and you don't take any damage. Super good, I highly recommend leveling it up, and if you don't have a keepsake yet, head to Olympus, keep running through until you encounter Dionysus. He also offers you some really nice boons. Unfortunately, in Tartarus, not everything was sunshine and roses, at least after the party ended, because the one weakness of his setup is things like the teleport skills. They don't group up properly, which means they don't get annihilated by all the splash and lightning effects. And since they teleport around and attack me, they're going to do a significant amount of damage. In the end, I was able to manage, but this is where I was really missing things like the Aphrodite cast, or pretty much any boon from Demeter, which would have allowed me to freeze them and thus annihilate them before they could do anything. But then, something big happened. About halfway through Tartarus, I did it. Finally, I found the Path of Stars. Yes, that's right. It only took 2 whole zones, but I did manage to find it. All that stands between me and it is a few enemies. Luckily, they won't last very long. The big question is, does the Path of Stars give anything interesting or relevant to the build? The end options were +2 strike or Omega Moves trigger. Since we're not really using Omega Moves, obviously that is not the right choice. But Ferocity says that you get your attack boon bonuses, meaning that yes, the Wave Strike from Poseidon will trigger on every single beam. That is a great option. And from here, it was a matter of taking Scorn for more damage, especially with consecutive hits on a boss like Kronos, or the +2 strikes. Because I felt like my single target was pretty good here, I went for +2 strikes just to see how it worked. But honestly, thinking back, Scorn would have been the much better option. This is why you try stuff. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. I mean, everything else from the build is great, but definitely go with Scorn. That way, your strikes build up damage on a single target, as long as you're able to stay close to them. And yes, finally, testing it out felt so good. Look at all those splashes. I mean, okay, I melted enemies before, and I melted enemies now. Maybe there's not that much of a difference. But as the person playing the build, I could absolutely feel the difference, and having all of those additional waves trigger, especially when triggering the Hex is a fire and forget button, felt really, really good. To the point where I feel like it's a totally viable build path to just go Selene attack boon Hex, don't worry about Omega moves at all, and just keep bashing into things with the strongest attack you can find. So the build fully assembled, and most of the enemies in Tartarus cleared, only one challenge remained, that being Kronos. Now, I'm going to be honest, I played the Kronos fight really recklessly. Do not use this as an example of how to do Kronos. But you know what? The theme for this video and this build has been playing the game wrong and succeeding anyway. So actually, it was right on brand. If you're curious about what I mean, this is how the Kronos fight went.
I'm home.
You look a bit unwell. The Titan of Foresight confessed that you were able to withstand his fury, to which I said, Prometheus, my good fellow, if you knew this would transpire, why did you not forewarn me? And why did you not prevent it?
Perhaps you overestimate the Titan of Foresight's power to clearly see into the future, along with his strength.
He claims to keep the details of the future to himself, so as not to alter the desired outcome. How convenient. It does not take a genius such as he to know I shall eventually prevail. Come, my subjects, prove yourselves to me. Stop now.
Yeah, that was pretty smooth. I had tons of burst damage, though I did make a pretty big mistake at the end and lost 2 death defiances. Maybe going for the greed there wasn't the best thing, but hey, I had plenty of death defiances, and it's not a resource if you don't use it. So, Chronos down, all that's left is to talk about the build a little bit more, then wrap everything up. With that said, if you're enjoying the video, which you probably are since you're near the end, do be sure to leave a like. Also, if you want to see more of this stuff, get subscribed and ring that notification bell to see whenever I upload. Going into this, I honestly felt like I was playing the aspect wrong. After all, sealing all your magic, at least for most of the run, and using 0 Omega moves on something with Omega move synergy clearly can't be correct, right? Well, yes and no. Because I think the developers at Supergiant have actually done a really good job of enabling multiple different playstyles for the weapons and their aspects. So yeah, there's a playstyle where you play with Omega moves, and you use your Hex to amp the damage of them. There's also a playstyle where instead you focus on your attack and you use your Hex as a second attack that kind of passively charges up as you deal damage to enemies, which is what I did, and it was frighteningly effective. The Hex hits quite a few times, and this can be extended through a Path of Stars. Having Wave Strike does massive amounts of splash damage, basically instantly solving your AoE. Though if you can't get Wave Strike, I'd recommend going for either Hera or Apollo, as those work really well for increasing AoE damage. An Exhaust Riser means that your Dash Strike hits way more, meaning it triggers your attack way more, thus doing more damage and applying secondary effects. About the only thing I would have changed is either A, going for an Aphrodite cast, that way I could have dragged enemies together, making it much easier to AoE them down, or B, instead of getting Blitz on my special, which added damage that I kind of didn't need, going with a Demeter special so that I could seize the enemies, thus preventing a lot of the damage that I was taking throughout the earlier fights. TLDR, get Exhaust Rider, get AoE, power up Selene with Path of Stars, enable Origination, and you've got yourself a pretty darn good build. That's going to be about it for me today. If you want more Hades 2 content, well, you can check out my thoughts on the Olympic update as a whole, or head over to MaxwellGG where there's a variety of guides covering the game. Before I go though, there's one thing I'm curious about. What do you think of a video format? It's something that I'm experimenting with a little bit, where instead of just recording myself as I play through the run, kind of giving you the stream of consciousness, whatever comes to mind, in this case, I'm cutting it down to a much shorter, much more concise version of a run, and then narrating over the key moments. It's something I'm experimenting with. You might actually see some runs in the other style as well, less editing, more stream of consciousness, and there's a good chance that there'll be more of whichever one does better. But if you have any strong preferences, be sure to share them down below. For now, thanks for watching to the end. I'm glad you enjoyed. I'll see you in the next one.